Yeah, hello to everybody. I know it's been a long day for you, and I just arrived from Germany, so I hope you still have some hunger for an interesting presentation. A bit according to what the professor just mentioned, I will concentrate more on a long-term perspective here, and I think he stated quite well that this is very important. So you can now expect a bit more a macro view on global issues on Europe and China and the US. All right, see how that works here. Okay, it works. I would like to give you some insights today about Europe, China, and the US in an uncertain global world. And I think it is quite clear that geopolitics get more complex again, and multilateralism is challenged from the far west, so from the US mainly, and it is reshaped from you here in China. And at the same time, and I think this is very important, we have some long-term drivers of change that are much more influential and powerful in the long run. And I will come back to a few of them in the next few minutes. And I think all of those will give us some work in the next few years, and you might have recognized that 2 weeks ago we had an election in Europe, so we have a new parliament in Europe. We will get a new commission, a new European government soon, and I think they will have to deal with all those challenges. And myself, I come from a company that is called Prognos. I will just give you some small ideas about what we do. We are based in Basel in Switzerland. We are, you could call it a spin-off of the Basel University. It has been 60 years ago that we were founded by two professors who thought it is quite a good idea not just to do it for the academian world, but to do it for the practical world. And so our ambition is to transfer these academic thinking about economic development to public decision makers. So to governments, basically in Europe, and of course to big companies or business associations as well. We employ about 200 economists in Europe, in Germany, in Brussels, in Belgium, where the European Commission is sitting, and of course in Switzerland. So that might give you an impression what we do, and we do it now for 60 years, and we are very much focused on long-term forecasts. So we are not so much interested in what will happen next year, but much more what are the global trends in the next 10, 20, and even 25 years from now. And I can tell you, we are doing this now for 60 years, that works. Of course, we have to cope with some challenges as well, but you can, with some trends, look quite into the future. And to give you an impression about that, I'm afraid this is not easy to read because I'm standing here just in front of the chart, but I borrowed it from the European Commission. They just issued a study on global trends 2030, and they differentiate a little between megatrends. Megatrends, you all know, they are quite visible today. For example, demographic change is one of those megatrends. They have quite a high degree of certainty, and they are well, I would say, researched. Then we could talk about catalysts. They have a much higher degree of uncertainty. So there are uncertain certainties, if you would like to put it like that. They move much faster than megatrends, and they can, of course, accelerate things and megatrends and other trends a lot. And then we have game changers. Game changers have the lowest degree of certainty, and they are very much dependent on actual human decisions of today. So those are much more difficult to incorporate into your research and studies. Today I will concentrate myself on 4 things. I will talk about economic growth, global growth. I will talk about demography, and of course I will talk a little on international trade. It was just mentioned before I came to the stage, and we will see what comes out of it. So this is a cartoon. It is, unfortunately, it is in German, so you won't be able to read it, but it shows some areas where all those catalysts and global trends will lead to results, and I will concentrate on a few areas here, so you will see the picture from time to time. The first area I will touch is the global economy. You see here some boats, China, US, and Europe. Those are the big economies in the world. And like, as you can see with the boats at the moment, Europe and the US are a little bit ahead of China. But as we all know, and you know especially, China is catching up with an enormous speed. So this chart will get changed soon. And then the order will look different than it looks today. Coming to the figures. Where does the future growth come from? And you see it comes from you. Like 31% of all growth, a third of the growth that we will have to expect comes from China. And still quite some growth comes from the US, well above 20%. And you can see that Europe, growth-wise, is already lagging behind in the future. I will come back to some reasons for that later on. And then we have covered Latin America with our models. Unfortunately, and this is an area we still have to work on, we are not able to cover Africa at the moment because the data we get from there is not reliable enough. So I have to leave out Africa here today, which is a shame because I think we can expect some development there on the demographic side, but on the economic side as well. But China is definitely the country where we can expect most growth coming from. So to put it a bit on a longer scale, you see here a chart from 1995 up to 2045. So this is quite some time, 25 years back and in the future. and that's how it looks like. The long-term perspective is not so negative. The economic performance of the countries we cover, those are 42 countries, which is about 95% of the global GDP at the moment. That will increase by 80% until 2045. So we will see growth, but of course the growth rates will decrease a little. Not just in the Western world, but here in China as well. I think you can at the moment already experience this growth decline, but of course still your growth is much higher than the growth in Europe or in the US. And the differences in the growth between the regions is as follows. Europe will grow about 50%. The US will be even quite impressive with 70-something percent. But in Asia, especially China and India, here 2 examples, they will grow twice or even 3 times as strong as, for example, Europe or the United States. So they are the growth stars of the future. I think everybody has incorporated that situation now in their strategies. So that means the view on the economic world is different now than it has been for the last decades. And the interrelations between those regions, of course, is very intense. And I will come back to a scenario later on, a trade conflict scenario. And there we will see how growth can be endangered by trade conflicts as they might appear on the horizon. But this is not the only view you can take on the global economy. There is another view, and I think this is an important view as well, because we see differences in the income per capita, the income per person in the major regions. And there you can see that this is the situation. Where's China? China is up there. So you have to read this chart a little. You have the until 2045. You have the best growth rates, 4% in average. You see, like in the traditional strong economies, like in Europe or in the US, growth is a lot slower, but like with the size of the bubbles, you see that the per capita income still will be higher in, I would call it now, the Western world for this moment, will be still higher than, for example, in China. And I know, of course, that China is not China, but like in the eastern part of your country, it comes very close now to, and will be on the same level like it is in Europe or in the US. But like over the whole country, it still, even in 25 years, the per capita income will be a lot lower. And those differences come from different speeds in economy on one hand, and on the other hand in what I would call the demographic development. And there are countries like your country and my country where we see that the society is getting old in quite a high development. So those are the main drivers for this. And I would really say, besides technology, and I think today you talked quite intensively about technology, we should not underestimate the demographic change as a key driver for the next few years, or for the next 2 decades or 3 decades. Today, it looks like this. So China and India are by far the biggest regions in the world, followed by Europe with quite a distance, and then the US and some other countries, like, for example, you see Brazil here on the 4th position. But it's not just about size, it's about age as well, and it's in the end about the working population. And here you can see with the dotted line those countries who grow and stay young, and all countries below the dotted line, they sometimes grow, like, for example, the US or Brazil, but they already get older. India has the best position in that chart. I would absolutely say that some African countries, or countries like Pakistan, Indonesia, we don't cover here, are in a similar position. But like countries like China or Europe as a whole, especially countries like Germany, Italy, Eastern European countries, they get rapidly older. And I think the best studied country in this development is Japan. And that has a huge impact on economy, because it will lead to a lack of competitiveness. It will lead to a lack or a lagging behind in innovation, and of course it will not it will not be good for the trade, international trade situation as well. So I think this is something we should be aware of, and it's something that Europe and China have in common. As you know, Europe has a lot of discussion about migration, so migration can be part of the answer, but of course it is a difficult answer, and maybe you have followed the struggles we have around the migration issue, but in the end we have to secure a certain workforce in the future as well. So now I promised you to talk a bit about a scenario. And maybe I should implement one thought before. What we do are forecasts, we call it prognoses, and we do scenarios. A prognosis or a forecast incorporates a development that we see as most probable. So until very recent, I would have always said, the brain decides in the end, and there won't be an emotional trade policy be successful in the end. Unfortunately, I'm not so sure anymore, and that has a lot to do with one person that was already mentioned before, who is the President of the United States. He is a wild elephant on the scene, and so it's getting more and more difficult really to see and to forecast how reactions will be. So it is time for scenarios, and that means to implement alternative thinking into your models. I will present you now a very careful scenario. This is not a worst case scenario. It could be much worse, I can tell you, but even a very moderate scenario I will present you now, you will see will have some big impacts on global economy, and maybe you are surprised later who will be affected most. So here you have the countries, the US, Canada, Mexico, Germany, and China, of course. I will give you a deeper look afterwards into Europe. That might be interesting for you as well. And you can see some effects here already. But before I talk about the effects, I should say something about how it works. So trade is always affected or can be affected by some issues, and what the US did, not just to you but to Europe as well, are implementing punitive tariffs. And punitive tariffs, of course, lead to counter actions, and so it is a revolving system that in the end will affect everybody. And if import prices in the US are rising, inflation is rising, and finally it will lead to higher interest rates of the US Federal Reserve as well. And on the other side, the same thing will happen. So the question is, how does the whole system will get influenced by it, and what will be the effect on countries? And we see the country that gets affected most is the US themselves, and Canada too. And that is because they are very dependent on imports. Your country is not so dependent on imports. And Germany is not so dependent on imports or other European countries. So in the end, the US will hit themselves hardest. And that's what, for me, is so, or is the big question, because I think there is not just Donald Trump. There are some smart people around him, and they must see those effects. But obviously, it is not really possible to influence him, and that's a bit frightening, I can tell you. So the US will get get hit hardest, but some neighbor countries of the US as well, Mexico and Canada especially. And in Europe, I think that now comes a European chart. No, it's still a global chart. I think the European chart comes later. So this is the effect on the GDP for the countries, and maybe I concentrate now on the US, on Germany, and on China. And you see, starting with China, China is affected least, because we think that, first of all, you are not so dependent on imports, and secondly, you can find alternative markets in Asia. For the US, this is much more difficult, and for Canada and for Mexico, whereas like Germany is not in just a good situation like China, but still we are talking here about severe impact. So in the US, the GDP will be in 2020 almost 1% lower than it could be in the base scenario. In 2025, it will be even a bit worse. And for the whole economy, the global economy, it will be almost 0.5%. So it is something, and this is still like a very mild scenario. We just looked at what was already implemented at the moment. So it can get worse. And to give you a little view on that, so this is Europe I was talking about before. I think out of time constraints, I leave that out. But a full-blown trade war would have really catastrophic consequences. And what does a full-blown trade war means? That means we are talking about real trade restrictions like quotas or red tape or import bans. And they will then, of course, affect the productions and value chains that have been established in the last 2 decades between China and Germany, but between all sort of countries. And if they are destroyed once, they will not be easily re-established. So this is something really to think of. And what even shivers me more is that we could develop back to a world with 2 trade blocks, like a Western bloc and a Chinese bloc. And I think this is really dangerous, and it's especially dangerous for Europe, because I would imagine that the US would question our position in that game. And I think actually for Europe it would be a very hard question to answer, as you can imagine. We have long time relations on the other Atlantic side, and we can see a little how this works in the question of how the US asks us not to do business with Iran at the moment. This is like the scenario in a nutshell. And to put that on a larger scale, I think everybody here in this room can imagine what that could mean. And so I think we all together should work against it. And I'm not so sure if in 2 years we will have another president in the White House. So with another president in the White House, I would be relieved much more. But I don't know what happened. I do not do election forecasts, fortunately. But at least it could happen that this policy gets another 4 years. And so I think we have, China and the EU have to do everything in our strategic interest to negotiate in a calm way and to find pragmatic ways to deal with this actual situation. And because the dilemma that might happen to Europe, I think, should be taken serious, especially here in this country. And I think Europe and China have developed a very good economical relationship in the last 3 decades. And so for Europe, this relationship is a big opportunity. But on the other hand, we can't like cut off the ties we have to the US. So we have to find an equilibrium. And let me conclude with a personal opinion. I think never in history trade conflicts or even trade wars brought about winners. It just produces losers. And as you could see in the chart where I showed you the situation for the US, the biggest loser often is the one who initiated the whole process. But still, I think the moment is not to get angry about. We have to find ways for intelligent negotiation. Thank you very much.